Hey gardeners, welcome back to my channel. So today I wanted to make a video talking all about how to set up a veiled chameleon enclosure. I've been getting questions a lot lately. It seems like a lot of people are getting veiled chameleons and they are not really sure how to set up their enclosure. So hopefully this video will help you guys out and you'll be able to see exactly everything that you should need for your enclosure and some things that you may not need as well. So the very first thing that comes with a veiled chameleon enclosure or any other type of chameleon enclosure is that it has to be a screen enclosure. You never want to put a veiled chameleon in a glass enclosure just because they do need a lot of airflow. This can be a little confusing because people don't understand how it's even possible to keep up a high humidity within a screen enclosure, but I'm going to go over all of that today. Now there are different sizes for screen enclosures. Veiled chameleon babies and all other chameleon babies are very, very tiny. So a lot of people don't want to get a larger enclosure for their veiled chameleon if it's still so small. You can honestly go either way. You can get a smaller enclosure for when it's small and then upgrade it in time, or you can just put the baby in the larger enclosure. The only thing is you want to make sure that there's a ton of foliage so that way your chameleon can feel safe within that enclosure. You don't want to ever put a chameleon in a space that's very wide open with not much foliage because that will stress them out. So the minimum for a veiled chameleon, you're going to want an enclosure that's at least 4 feet tall, 2 feet wide, and goes back 2 feet as well. That is exactly what I have Banba in, and it seems to work perfectly for him. If you honestly want to go larger than that, the larger the better because it's just more space for them to roam around. Although I do find that my chameleon just stays within the same places every single day. So if you do want to start off with a smaller enclosure for your baby chameleon, you do want to keep in mind that chameleons grow very, very fast. Banba was full grown within 3 to 4 months of having him, and he started out as a tiny little baby. So just because they do grow so fast, you will have to upgrade them very quickly. So honestly, it may be easier just to get them the larger enclosure to start off with and let them grow into it because they do grow so fast. So the second most important thing when it comes to setting up a veiled chameleon enclosure is the foliage. So foliage is the plants around the enclosure for the chameleon to hide in and feel secure. So you can go 2 different ways with this. You can use live plants or you can use fake plants. I use both within my enclosure and I find that they both work perfectly. If you're going to be using fake plants for a veiled chameleon, I find that the plastic ones work best because the water droplets last on there longer. It's easier for your chameleon to be able to lick the water droplets off of a plastic plant rather than one that's made out of fabric, and the fabric ones can get pretty gross in time and bacteria can grow on them, so you don't want to be using those. Just the plastic ones usually work the best for chameleons. If you are going to be using live plants, you do want to make sure that whatever live plant you're going to be using is safe for your chameleon. Veiled chameleons in particular are known to eat a little bit of vegetation in the wild, so on the off chance that your chameleon does try to eat some of the plants in the enclosure, you want to make sure that they aren't going to be toxic for your chameleon. You also want to make sure that depending on where you're getting your plants from, that there aren't going to be any pesticides on that plant whatsoever because chameleons do drink the water droplets off of the plants within the enclosure and you don't want them to be licking up any pesticides or toxins that way. So the best thing that I do is whenever I get a plant for Banba or any other animal, what I do is I wash the plant off with a toxic-free soap and water. Just completely scrub the plant down entirely, every single leaf and everything on it. The best thing to do is maybe do this a couple of times and give it a week before you put it within the enclosure just to be safe because you just don't want there to be any pesticides on that plant whatsoever for your animal. And there are websites that you guys can check to look for plants that are safe for your chameleon. There's so many different plants that you can use. I find that pothos is actually one of the best ones and it's actually safe for the chameleons to eat as well. So you may find your veiled chameleon snacking on some pothos. I don't have any in my enclosure right now, but I would like to add some in the future because I love me some pothos. Another thing with plants is that if you are using a live plant that has soil at the bottom, you do want to make sure that you have that covered up properly because on the off chance that maybe an insect crawls on top of that dirt or something, you don't want your chameleon to accidentally eat any of that because it can cause impaction, and some soil has like those little white or green looking things. I think it's like plant food or something for the plant, but those can be toxic for your chameleon, so you don't want them to eat that. So what I'm doing is I'm actually using a little screen. I buy the ones that are for the drainage layer for like exoterras, and I put that on top of the soil for the live plants within my enclosure, just to make sure that Banba here doesn't eat anything that is toxic whatsoever. Along with foliage, you also want to make sure that you're going to be supplying your chameleon branches throughout the enclosure. You want to have a lot of horizontal climbing areas. They can climb up and down the screen all on the sides, but in order for them to find a really good place to bask, you want them to have branches throughout the enclosure, especially under the basking site where the heat is. That way they can warm up throughout the day there and thermoregulate at different levels of temperature throughout the enclosure. So when it comes to water bowls and food bowls for veiled chameleons, the chameleons will actually not drink from water bowls whatsoever. They don't like standing waters, so if the water's just sitting there not moving, it's not going to interest them whatsoever, and they aren't going to go and try to lick any of that water up. So the best thing to do is actually just to spray down the enclosure or use a misting system or a drip machine. All of those things, as long as they can lick the water droplets off of the plants around the enclosure, that's how they hydrate themselves in the wild, and that's how they do it in captivity as well. You can, however, use a food bowl for your chameleon. You can leave random insects around for them to hunt, because Banba definitely does that with his crickets. But I use a food bowl to supply him his worms, and I also put in some vegetation and like collard greens or mustard greens, turnip greens. I do that once a week, and I give him a little bit of vegetation. That's more for my care video though, so if you guys are interested in veiled chameleon care, I'll put the link in my description. But so yeah, you can use a food bowl for them, but the water bowl isn't going to be necessary whatsoever, and it's really not going to do anything for them. So when it comes to lighting, you never want to be using a red or a blue light bulb whatsoever for veiled chameleons. You do want to use one that is going to give them the proper temperatures. I use a 75-watt heat bulb for Banba, and it works perfectly for him to give him the temperature that he needs for his hotspot. The other thing that is critical for veiled chameleon care is actually their UVB. So most times what you will see at pet stores are the coil UVBs. I would highly recommend not using these whatsoever. A lot of people have used them and their chameleons end up getting metabolic bone disease. The problem with these UVBs is that they do not reach down far enough within the enclosure to give the chameleon the full spectrum lighting that they need. So the UVB is very important to prevent metabolic bone disease, and the only UVB that will work properly for a very tall chameleon enclosure are the long tube UVBs. These reach down very far into the enclosure to make sure that they're getting the lighting that they need, and it will really prevent them from getting sick. So it's just very, very, very important that you guys make sure you get the proper UVBs. It's really annoying that they really don't sell them as often anymore, and you will typically see the spirals being sold at Petco or PetSmart, so just be sure to keep an eye out for that. So the last thing that I wanted to cover in this video are misting machines, fogging machines, and the water droplet machines. So misting machines are such a perfect thing for veiled chameleons because you can set them on a timer. They will go off throughout the day if you have work and you're not home to spray for your chameleon. That way the misting machine will spray all of the plants within the enclosure, increase that humidity, and your chameleon will be able to hydrate himself by licking all of the water droplets off of the plants within the enclosure. A lot of people want to use fogging machines for chameleons, which is perfectly fine for increasing humidity. However, the fogging machine is not going to create any water droplets whatsoever, so your chameleon will not be able to hydrate itself with a fogging machine. So that's very important to keep in mind, and I would recommend the misting machine over the fogging machine just because of that. There's these little plastic containers that form water droplets within your enclosure. These also work great for chameleons. When you're using this, you do want to make sure that you set it up properly and that it will drop on leaves in the enclosure. You don't want it to just fall to the bottom and create a pool. And if you are going to be using this or a misting system, you may want to put something at the bottom of your enclosure just to make sure it can catch the water, because you don't want a pool of water all over your floor, because that's not a good time. I personally just mist Banba's enclosure because I'm home every day, so I'm just here to do it. So I just manually do it every single day to make sure that he's being hydrated. And that's pretty much everything when it comes to setting up a veiled chameleon enclosure. So you just really want to make sure that there is a lot of foliage, especially if you have a baby, because they're still very unsure of what's going on. They're going to be very prone to stress. And with chameleons, the one thing you always want to do is just reduce their stress levels as much as you possibly can. And you're going to make sure that your chameleon is very healthy and happy with you in captivity. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys Banba's enclosure. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Banba's enclosure, and it looks like he is trying to escape over here, but I need you to stay in there. Are you gonna come out? He's been wanting to come out a lot lately because I think he wants to make babies. But okay, so this is his enclosure. This giant plant is actually called a corn plant. So I really like it. I was sure to wash it off, make sure it's nice and safe for him. Banba, what are you doing? So he has more climbing branches throughout his enclosure. It's kind of hard to see all of them because they're actually behind this plant. Behind this plant over here, so they're kind of hard to see. This is his new basking area right over here. It's a little bit higher up than it was before. He also has these other two thick branches that he uses over there. He loves this little thing back here. I always forget what it's called. Everyone always asks me where I get this from, and I got it from Dr. Foster and Smith website. So he absolutely loves that thing. Highly recommend it for chameleons. It's really great for them. These vines are really great. They actually aren't plastic, but they're kind of crunchy, as you can see. I don't even know how to describe it, but water sits on it perfectly, and it's really great for him to be able to hydrate himself. In order to get the branches to stay in place, I actually used fishing line and tied it up on the screen. Someone just taught me this trick, and before I was like awkwardly trying to balance everything in the enclosure and popping things through the screen. It was just kind of a mess, so definitely use fishing line. I highly recommend doing that because it makes things way easier. He has his little food dish over here in the corner, so he can go there to get some worms or some salads when I feed him. And yeah, so there's just a lot of vines going around and branches and things to lick his moisture off of. And yeah, that is Banba's enclosure. Do you want to go back in there, buddy? There you go. So yeah, he seems very happy in here. He usually just stays right over here and basks, or he climbs along the side over here. And for some reason, he always just sleeps in that back corner. So he's a happy guy, and this is his enclosure. It's the 4-foot long enclosure, it goes back 2 feet, and it's 2 feet deep. So yeah.